As you should know from the title of the video, this is part 3 in my custom lightsaber build log. If you haven't seen the first 2 videos, the card popping up in the top right of your screen right now will take you to a playlist where you can check them out and see how I built the emitter and the battery/soundboard sections of my lightsaber. In this video, I'm going to be assembling the Kyber Crystal chamber, which is one of the coolest looking parts of the mb-sabers Metal Master chassis I'm building. In order to assemble the crystal chamber, I first had to assemble the battery/soundboard chamber, which is why I built it in my previous lightsaber build log. I first grabbed this little 3-pronged crystal holder piece from my 3D printed parts and set it into its place here atop the battery chamber. Later on, when I do the electronics, this will have an RGB LED in it, which will allow the crystal to light up in any color I choose. The next thing I needed to do was add a third M2 threaded rod to help hold everything together. And to do that, I first needed to insert this M2 nut into this slot on the battery compartment, and then thread the M2 rod into that nut. With all 3 threaded rods in place, I was then able to begin assembling the radiator fin stack for the crystal chamber. You can buy these fins as a 3D printed part on Shapeways, but mb-sabers also sells a kit of laser cut fins with all the needed spacers on his website, and I chose to go that route because the reason I wanted to build his Metal Master chassis is because I love all of the detailing, and I feel the laser cut fins provide the look that I'm wanting. I first had to put one of these little brass spacers onto each of the threaded rods, followed by one of the laser cut fins. I then repeated this process until all the fins were in place. To lock the fins into position, I grabbed 3 of the threaded spacers that came with the fin kit and threaded them onto the threaded rods. It was then time to put on the last fin, which is a different shape and thickness from the other 7 fins. I then secured it to the rest of the fins using 3 more threaded spacers. At this point, I was ready to prep this piece, which is the top plate of the crystal chamber. Prepping this piece took me longer than most all of the rest of the crystal chamber. There's all these little holes that have 1mm diameter brass rods that go into them, and getting them cleaned out and widened enough to be able to insert the rods was a bear of a task. Now, the reason it was so difficult for me is because of the material I chose for this piece. I chose to have it printed out of steel, which is, as you probably know, a very hard metal. Had I chosen a softer metal like brass, then this would have been a much easier task. Anyway, after several hours of struggling with it, I was finally ready to move on to the next step. This part of the build I really loved doing because it was when I got to add all the wire detailing and stuff. I started with 2 straight 1mm rods on either side of the long threaded rod. To be able to install them and the other wire detailing, I first had to loosen up all the threaded spacers and move the fins away from the battery compartment. Now that I had a nice amount of empty space between things, the rods went in nice and easy. It was then time to move on to the slightly trickier wire details that are integrated into the fins. I grabbed some needle nose pliers and got to work bending 2 pieces of wire into a U shape. After making the first bend, I then fed the wire through one of the holes in the fins it's supposed to go through, and then used the other hole to figure out the second bend. Once both wires were properly bent, I fed them through the fins like so, and then it was time to shift everything back down again. With everything all assembled like this, the spacers and fins have a tendency to get caught up on the threaded rods, so it took me several minutes to get everything all moved back into place. But I eventually got it and screwed the threaded spacers back down. Once I got everything to this point, there was some brass tubing that needed to be cut to length and placed over the 2 straight rods next to the long threaded rod. To determine the length I needed to cut them at, I first placed the tubing up next to the rods, marked them, and then used my Dremel to cut them off. It was then a simple task of slipping the tubes over the rods and through the holes in the radiator fins. Once both rods were in place, I could finally put the final fin back in place and secure it using the threaded spacers. The next item of business was to secure my Kyber crystal to the 3-pronged crystal holder, and I chose to do this using some short M1.6 screws. I first had to drill out these holes, then tap each of them for the screws, and finally install the screws. Once my 3D printed plastic crystal was secure in the holder, I got to work on the final piece of the crystal chamber. Yep, I am finally getting back to this guy. The first thing I needed to do for this was glue the 3 pieces that make up the top portion of the crystal chamber together. I first glued this inner ring piece to the crystal chamber top piece, and then glued the 6-pronged crystal holder on top of it. From there, I installed these 2 brass tubes, which are part of the Metal Master assembly kit, into the holes on the crystal chamber top piece, like this. And with that, it was ready to install this little add-on piece I bought, because it looks cool. This piece just slides over top of the tubes like this, and with that done, we're ready to put the top on our crystal chamber and the other little finishing touches. The top piece slid into place fairly easily, and afterward, I spent several hours making these wire detail pieces here. These serve no useful purpose whatsoever. They're just for adding a little customization and to look cool. So I'm getting down toward the end of this build. The final section of the chassis I need to build is called the Plasma Gate, which not only sounds cool, but is also equally cool looking, in my opinion, to the crystal chamber. Once I get that all put together and have the chassis fully assembled, it'll be time to pull it all apart again so I can install all the electronics, and then we'll see if I can actually pull this lightsaber build off.
Hey, what just happened? Why am I all tiny now? Oh, this is the end of the video where you can put links to other videos and stuff. To anyone still watching at this point, I want to say thank you. I love you. We should hang out sometime. You know, get a big gulp, eat some nachos. No? Okay, I respect that.